welcome back to the morning of the CSNSF Third Symposium and to our distinguished guest scientist presenter, Dr. Melvin Konner is the Samuel Chandler Dobbs Professor in the Department of Anthropology and the program in Neuroscience and Behavioral Biology at Emory University, where he teaches courses on human biology, human-brain behavior interaction, on the biological approaches to childhood, human nature, male-female relationships, medicine, and society. I believe you're currently working on a book describing your research and thinking on religion and science. I first heard Dr. Konner present in, I believe it was 1985, at the Georgetown Family Center, where he was the distinguished guest speaker, and I've had the privilege of hearing him speak and talk about his work in discussion with Bowen Theory 3 more times since then. I am so looking forward to today. Please enjoy Dr. Konner's biography and blog on his website, melvinkonner.com. Not while he is speaking, however, but later. And the 2 presentations by Dr. Konner will provide, I anticipate, having that 2% of my intellect stirred further in consideration of the forces active in human evolution and adaptation, both as challenges and opportunities for the present and the future. Dr. Konner, welcome to the symposium and your time.
Can you hear me if I speak at this level? Back? Great. Thank you so much, Victoria. And Mom, if you're listening, that sounded pretty good, right? I mean, actually, my mom knows the bad stuff too, so that you didn't talk about. It's a great honor for me to be here. It's a pleasure, as well as an honor, and to give me the opportunity to lecture twice in a 2-day conference is all the more interesting, exciting, and all the more of an honor. I have already learned a lot this morning and resonated to a lot. Louise Rausio, who conceived of having me come here and do this on this topic, used the phrase living in this anxious world, and it certainly is something that is certainly a concept that I resonate to. I would say that anxiety in the context of evolution is probably a result of our need for vigilance throughout our evolution and history. And so what we think of as a sort of vibrating continuous level of anxiety that may often seem inappropriate in our current situations and interfere with things may well have been a positive adaptation that made our ancestors more vigilant about a dangerous world and able to adapt. Victoria Harrison talked about, I believe it's John Calhoun, who said that the expert on the guy who did experiments on crowding, who said we could be entering dark ages such as we have never seen, and that is if we don't get 52% of the population to be on the same page with regard to ensuring human survival. and I certainly resonate to that too. The on my office table, I have a couch and I sit in a chair, and it's at office hours. It's a little bit like a counseling office. If something serious comes up, I recognize it because I went to medical school, and I always refer those people to where they belong. But my office hours are certainly 3 or 4 hours every Tuesday afternoon and evening. And I stay as long as necessary to see everybody who's hanging out there, or like counseling, and not just advising in many ways. I have on my on my table in front of the couch a globe and a model of the brain, and I'm always referring to one or both of them in every conversation with every student. And we have lots of international students, and I always make them point exactly on the globe to where they came from. And of course, in the anthropology department, we have lots and lots of students who are going somewhere really interesting somewhere in the world, and they do the same. One of my favorite stories is about this brilliant small young woman named Tu Nguyen, who is Vietnamese. She speaks with a substantial accent. She speaks very, very articulately. She's going to medical school. Her parents are manicurists in Atlanta, and she in a suburb, and she was in my office one day asking me for advice about how to adapt in Uganda, rural Uganda, where she was going to help mothers and babies learn more about infant and child health. So that's the kind of situation I'm in all the time, and the symbolism of the brain and the globe sitting there in front of me and in front of the students is a very important one for me. To say that Joanne Bowen is my kind of anthropologist. I mean, really and seriously, that was a great lecture, and what she had to say about the Kung or Zhenghuasi, which are the people that I lived with for 2 years, I could not have done it better. I could not have done it as well, because sometimes you get too close to something that you know very well, and it's a sign of true scholarship in anthropology that Dr. Bowen, and it's one of our tests, that somebody else tells you about the people that you really know intimately, and it's all true and right, accurate picture. But then the other thing about Dr. Bowen's lectures, the references to Julian Stewart. So I'm older than you are, and Julian Stewart was part of my education, and I was taught to start with the environment in thinking about human societies, human cultures, human experiences. I studied with John and Beatrice Whiting at Harvard Graduate School, and they were devotees of Stewart's approach, and they had a model that they were interested in cross-cultural. They did cross-cultural scientific systematic studies of child behavior, and therefore of families and child rearing, and they started with the environment. And if something that we call the subsistence ecology, which Dr. Bowen talked about as the relationship of labor to the land, and then that determines many aspects of social structure and family type and family dynamics, and therefore child rearing, which then determines some degree of adult personality, which then goes on to influence the culture. Now, the Whitings, especially Johnny Whiting, used to have arrows only flowing in that direction, and if you drew feedback arrows, he would say that's a chicken model because it doesn't generate testable hypotheses. That part I didn't quite agree with, and not only that, but since those days in the 50s when they developed this, or 60s, there has been a growing awareness that humans are changing the environment and have always done so, and the changes that humans have made in the environment, which which you could see in Dr. Bowen's examples of Cusco and Suffield, as well as, to a lesser extent, the Kung themselves and other hunter-gatherers. You need that feedback arrow, and now, and civilizations have collapsed many times in many places because of human impact on the environment and the feedback with that feedback arrow, and we're in one of those situations right now. Yeah, the way Louise and I talked about what I would do is that I would talk about the obstacles to change today and the positive prospects for change tomorrow. So I'm sure many of you know in your own work that you sometimes have to make people feel bad before you make them feel good. I'm going to make you feel really bad today, and then I'm going to try and make up for it tomorrow. So, okay. This is divided into, I think, 8 parts. The first one is called Origin Stories. This is from Genesis. Cain says to God, he said, "I know not, am I my brother's keeper," famously. And here's Rubens' painting of Cain slaying Abel. So, the next slide shows another episode from Genesis after Noah and his family survived the flood. I often wonder what Dr. Bowen would say if he analyzed the families in Genesis. And, it'd be pretty. A lot of them have to be diagnosed with something. And anyway, God speaks to Noah, and Noah makes a sacrifice and says, "I will not curse the ground anymore for man's sake, for the will of the heart of man is evil from his youth." Ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra min rav. And that's what I studied when I was growing up. And there's my bar mitzvah picture. So you want to see where I'm coming from originally. It's from those texts that had a very important influence on me, and I was very religious as a boy, and actually until age 17. So I do understand religion from the inside, and I also resonated to Louise's recommendation: pray, meditate, think, and study. I had prayed a lot until my late teens, and teenage boys don't meditate a lot, but I did think and study a lot, and increasingly I substituted thinking and studying for prayer and science for religion. So that's the Big Bang, and so I had a new origin story after I learned about the history of Earth and the true story of the history of life. This is an artist's depiction of the event, the asteroid impact in the Yucatan that destroyed the dinosaurs among many other species on Earth. So that's a quotation from the scientific view, not from the Bible. Okay, so this is one of the early Archaeopteryx skeletons in the American Museum of Natural History. And when I was at Brooklyn College, which is where I went to college, I went to college talking about community in a place where I could see the clock tower of Brooklyn College from my bedroom when I was 8 years old, and that's the neighborhood where I stayed until I graduated from college. One of my anthropology professors had a friend who was studying Archaeopteryx at the American Museum, took me up there on a field trip to meet the guy, and you go down into the bowels of the museum, and and he showed me this specimen. And then he said, when he found out I was an anthropology major, I've always thought Archaeopteryx was very much like people, and I'm thinking, why? And here's what he said. And it was, hearing profanity in the halls of this august museum was a little jarring, but I agree with that completely, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about now. But let's first, well, a little late. So let's talk about how evolution works, very important. Animals engage in a struggle for existence, for resources, to avoid being eaten and to breed, very important. Environmental factors influence organisms to develop new characteristics to ensure survival, and thus transforming into new species. Animals that survive to breed can pass on their characteristics to offspring. So probably a quotation from Darwin's Origin of Species. Wrong. A philosopher named Al-Jahiz, Baghdad, in the 9th century wrote those words. It's not that complicated. In fact, after Darwin became famous, his friend and defender, in fact he's called Darwin's bulldog, another biologist named Thomas Huxley, said, how utterly stupid not to have thought of it. And it's a very simple idea, and everything we know has supported that idea. This is the book, 1859. Notice that Darwin had a master's degree, not a PhD, or an MD. And this is Huxley, who banged his head about not having thought of it. And these are phrases that came up about Darwin's theory. The struggle for existence was Huxley's phrase, not Darwin's. Nature red in tooth and claw was the poet Tennyson's phrase, not Darwin. And survival of the fittest was the sociologist Herbert Spencer's phrase, not Darwin. And all of those phrases, which we come to associate with Darwin, actually have problems, but some of which I'll maybe be able to talk about tomorrow. And here's how Darwin said it in the last words of The Origin of Species. There is grandeur in this view of life from so simple a beginning. Endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. And so there's a religious quality to his descriptions of evolution. In fact, if you read the rest of the passage, some editions have God in that paragraph, and they say, well, they don't say God, but they say that life is breathed by a creator into a few simple forms, which then, Okay, so, and here's what he wrote a few years earlier to a botanist, Joseph Hooker. What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horribly cruel works of nature. It's a slightly different private view from the public view in the end of The Origin of Species. Okay, so we will come back to evolutionary processes, but what are we like? That was a big question. By the time I was a senior in high school, I had studied history, and with a wonderful woman who I mentioned in the first edition of The Tangled Wing, and that brought us back together again, actually. Dora Vennet was her name. And I took world history and then advanced placement world history with Mrs. Vennet. And the things that happened, it reminded me of this quotation from Ulysses, the novel Ulysses, where Joyce says, I think it's Leopold Bloom saying, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to wake up. And that's sort of how I felt about history. And I said, I got to understand. I mean, I was studying physics too, and I knew that atoms were the units of chemistry, and maybe protons the units of physics, and I knew that humans were going to be the units of history. And if there was something wrong with history, there, be a good idea to study humans. So I formed the ambition of learning everything there was to know about the science of human nature, scientific approaches to human nature rather than philosophy or theology. I actually didn't realize that was not a big ambition at the time, because so little was known. Now it's a big ambition, and so over half a century later, I'm struggling to keep up with what we know about the growing science of human nature. But going back to the religious view, this is the classic Catholic idea of the seven deadly sins depicted here in an enlarged human heart and a very confused-looking young man. And these these are the downside of human nature as broken down to 7 parts by early or medieval Christians, really. Here's another depiction. They were very popular from the Middle Ages, and I'm going to concentrate on wrath, which I happen to think is one of the most dangerous things about human nature in the situation we're in the world now. Although lust and gluttony and and sloth and envy and pride definitely also contribute, and they are all part of human nature. So here's one of the first people to say, no, I'm not going to accept just philosophy. I'm going to try and turn this into a science. And as you know, he had this concept of the id and the ego and superego. And the id was the part that to some extent corresponded with the 7 deadly sins, or at least could easily go there. And one of his great sayings, and for all his flaws, there are certain things that he was right about and that he contributed that were very important. And one of his sayings that I love is, "Where id was, let ego be." Where id was, let ego be, and that means replacing those basic emotions, some of which are very negative, with a certain amount of rationality to mediate between humans and the world, and adapting to the world and protecting yourself. And superego is another word basically for conscience. But Freud did not really understand Darwin or evolution, but he did have an orientation toward what you might call a Darwinian orientation. He focused on the things that evolution should tell us to focus on, like aggression, like lust, and sex, like anxiety and fear. Those are things that evolutionary knowledge and theory both point to very strongly as things psychologists should focus on. And my understanding of Bowen theory, and now I've been here often enough now that I almost feel like a part of the Bowen family, and I want to thank Anne McKnight, who's director of the Bowen Center in Washington, for being the one who recommended me to Michael Kerr the very first time that I came to a Bowen meeting in 1985, so my understanding of how one of the ways Bowen theory differs from other kinds of family therapy and theory, one aspect is just looking at a wider aspect of biology and science than most family therapists do. The other is, of course, accepting the dark side of family dynamics and of life more than some other psychologists and family theorists do. It's still very common to encounter people who think that a family or a society or a community or kin group is really supposed to be in equilibrium, and that things are supposed to be calm, and that anything that you see that's sort of angry or dysfunctional or frightened or jealous or conflictful is a departure from the natural equilibrium, and what you really have to do is restore the natural equilibrium, and that's your job if you're a therapist. Sorry, that's not natural. Equilibrium is not natural. The struggle is natural. The conflict is natural. It's not hopeless to make a family work, but if you're making a family or a society work, it's really taking a slice in time where you're trying to make the conflict and the problem subside for a while, partly by replacing that with that, and it's not an easy job. And one of the reasons I'm focusing on the downside today is that I don't think that you have a hope of helping make the world or a family or a better functioning unit unless you start from a square, flat-on gaze at everything that's bad in human nature and in the way we've arrived here as a product of evolution. So this is my first attempt to outline the essence of human nature, and you can see that this was published originally in 1982, and showed it to Michael Kerr, and there's an overlap with the 7 deadly sins, but there are a couple of things that are not in that. And I'll talk a little bit more about those tomorrow, and about that language, and of course about change. So I wasn't just writing about the 7 deadly sins, but I was trying to understand the biology, what was known by 1980 or so about the biology behind all these things. And when I say biology, that includes, in my mind, psychology, environmental influences, and the whole, the way everything works together. Okay, so I'm going to focus on violence for a while now. These are depictions of fights. Some fights are ritualistic. It used to be said that humans were the only species that killed their own kind. That was soon overturned when enough person hours of field work and ethology and animal behavior and primatology were logged. It became very clear that was a false idea. But there are a lot of, somebody figured out that you have to watch a troop of 500 baboons for 500 years or 100 years in order to see one homicide if the baboon troop had the same homicide rate as Detroit, or New York City. So getting that evidence took a while, and it certainly it's there now. There are a lot of ritualistic fights in animals and humans, but lots of real ones too, and a lot of damage. So this is a classic wired-in higher primate threat face, rhesus monkey male bearing his canine teeth, and here you see that it has been preserved in humans. This is a lacrosse game, Time magazine cover in the early days when girls and women were getting their first opportunities to participate fully in sports, and you can see the higher primate threat face here. So it goes across sexes and across species. And here you have another type of ritual conflict, and it can be, as we know now, very dangerous. And it can also have a certain result, which is common in conflicts in the animal world. And so Darwin, in the Origin of Species, added a little fill-up about what I call a few words about what I call sexual selection, and that really was an essential addition. Then he wrote a whole book about uh, about sexual selection a little over a decade later, and that means the competition not for survival, but competition for reproduction, and mate choice is a very important part of that, and conflict between females to get access to males, and conflict between males to get access to females are all very important. And in fact, when I tell my students, in evolution, survival is the handmaiden of reproduction. You can see that in the example of the praying mantis, with a male, sometimes in mid-copulation, has his head bitten off by the female, and his survival is over, but it was more important for him to reproduce than survive. And so talk about losing your head over her. And if they're in mid-copulation when she eats his head, guess what he does? He finishes the copulation, of course. So that's the essence of evolution. Is the goal is reproductive success, and it's really, you think of it as very mechanistic and simple. It's only those individuals that reproduce leave genes in the next generation's gene pool, and the next, and the next, and the next, and then so we're here because of all that, all those millions of years of reproductive success. Yes, so here we have something that would be going on possibly right around us in Texas horse country, and I put this in because it's breeding. Darwin used artificial selection in animal breeding as one of the scientific foundations of his thinking about how natural selection could take place, and so you see artificial selection. I learned yesterday from Victoria, driving over here past all those wonderful, beautiful horse farms, about horse breeds, and and so they're breeding quarter horses, which I learned from her are horses that run quarter-mile races, and they're different from thoroughbreds, and they're also around here breeding horses that are specialized for roping, and horses that are specialized for herding and corralling, and at one point Victoria said to me, "Are you joshing me?" And I said, no, I didn't know this stuff. I mean, I know about breeding animals. I know about dog breeds. I don't even happen to know about bullfighting bull breeds, but I didn't know what the term quarter horse meant. And I think Victoria underestimated the difference between growing up in Brooklyn and growing up in Texas. It's really different. But I'm always trying to learn. Now, women also are horse breeders. And I say that because, women are champion barrel horse racers. That's another kind of horse that Victoria told me about. In fact, Victoria's sister-in-law is in the Cowboy Hall of Fame. Is that right? For her achievements in barrel racing and in teaching barrel racing. So back to Darwin, and basically, we could view evolution as a breeding experiment with males as the domesticated animals and females as the farmer. So that was my mentor, who was from Joy, Texas. His father was an itinerant preacher in East Texas, and mostly he identified himself with Joy. And he always said this when he taught about Darwin. He said, think about evolution as a vast breeding experiment in which females are the breeders and males are the domesticated animals that are being chosen and selected for perpetuating the species. But that doesn't mean that, and in birds, they're often selected for beauty, like the peacock, the male. But in many species, they're also selected for fighting ability. And one of the results is chimpanzee, which is our closest relative, and is a pretty violent species, highly social species like we are, and has very complex behavioral and learning ability, but extreme male dominance with assaults on females and assaults on other males, and to the point of killing. Oh shoot! I turned it off by pushing the wrong button. Let's see if I can press play. Get it back again. There it is. Okay, good. So there is intergroup aggression where groups confront each other on a territorial boundary and sort of hoot and yell at each other, but there are also ambushes and killings, which can result in group replacement. And this is a group of males described by primatologist John Matani. Male chimpanzees perform patrols, during which they gather and move in column formation directly to the periphery of the territory, and then they begin to look for contact with members, preferably isolated members of other communities, of neighboring communities of chimpanzees, and attacks are sometimes launched and result in the biting, stomping, kicking, and crushing to death of the victim from the other group. And Jane Goodall herself, who was very shocked by finding this out, her group described the replacement of one whole group of chimpanzees by another, in effect a conquest and a territorial expansion. So when you start looking in human evolution, you see a lot of evidence of violence, and the record is too thin still to calculate statistics, but I'll tell you how I think about that more tomorrow. But certainly anything that could be used to kill an antelope or a mammoth could easily be used to kill humans, and you do find spear points and arrow points in people's bodies in the human fossil record. One of the most famous cases is the Iceman, so-called, who lived about 5,000 years ago in northern Italy, and this probe is pointing to an arrow tip. Here's the arrow tip, and it was determined from autopsy that he bled out after being injured by an arrow. So here's an interesting thing, and I'll talk about this tomorrow. This is a recent book by Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis. Part of the increasing recognition that humans are the most cooperative species, and compared to apes and other primates, there's no doubt about that whatsoever. I mean, if you talk about herding animals, they're maybe more cooperative, but herding is not what we're talking about with cooperation. And so we're a very cooperative species, so I'll just posit that. But part of the question is why? And I will talk about that more tomorrow, but Bowles and Gintis, as well as others, think the reason is that hunter-gatherers were fighting all the time at a group level and engaging in war and engaging in group replacement, and only the groups that cooperated most within themselves were the ones that passed down their genes. So it's a type of group selection, and this is complete with mathematical models that I find very difficult to understand. But there are problems with the argument, which I'll come back to tomorrow. But it's kind of ironic and distressing, to me at least, that if we're the most cooperative species, but the reason is that we cooperate so well for war. And sociologists have known for ages. There's a book by a 50s sociologist named Louis Kozer called The Functions of Social Conflict. I actually took a course with him, which pretty well dates me. But he summarized the evidence at that time, which is now much greater, that during a war is when you get the absolute most cooperative behavior within a society that's facing an outward enemy. Okay, so here's back to sexual selection. The male and female of one chameleon species, male looks like this, and that happens to be from the Yiddish translation of the sexual selection book of Darwin, but it has the same original illustrations. And the males Some of you know that my last book was about the difference in aggressiveness and sexuality between males and females and the evolutionary perspective on that. And maybe some of you heard me talk about it in Wilmette last year, or the year before. So the males are definitely more aggressive in all primate species, and including humans. And this is a classic by Barbara Smatsa, and by the way, her father, who was not a scientist. Barbara was a distinguished primatologist, about male aggression and sexual coercion of females in non-human primates and other mammals, and it is very, very widespread. It's not a pretty picture, and so that was a 1993 article, followed up by this 2009 book, Sexual Coercion in Primates and Humans. It is part of human nature and the nature of other primates. Here's a baboon male who chases and threatens a fertile female and eventually shakes her out of the tree. This is a chimpanzee male harassing, grabbing, and beating a fertile female, and brutality leads to male dominance. and male dominance is severe in chimpanzees. This is a story that comes originally out of the research of Sarah Hurdy. We're giving an honorary degree to at my institution, Emory, in May, I have to say. And she did research on langur monkeys that you see depicted here in India. These are two males chasing a female with an infant. Male in this she discovered a pattern in which strange males come to a troop, try to drive out the resident males and take over the troop. If the resident males are older, like me, they get driven out, and the younger males take over. When the young males establish themselves, they kill all the infants under 6 months of age, which has the effect of bringing the females back into estrus. Their ovulatory cycles are no longer suppressed by the lactation process, and nobody's saying that these guys think that through, but it is something that has been selected for, and it has been. Last time I talked to Sarah about it, she said over 50 primate species where it happens. It also happens in many other species like lions, and it's a very nasty, maybe the nastiest aspect of primate behavior and male behavior, but there it is. And that's unfortunately a wounded infant. By the way, the females fight back as hard as they can to protect their infants. They just are overpowered by the strength of the males, which doesn't happen in all primate species, as I'll talk about tomorrow. And this is a Bruegel painting of the Roman soldiers carrying out Herod's order to kill all the infants in Palestine in an attempt to prevent the baby Jesus from growing up and becoming a threat to Roman rule. There's plenty of evidence in history of infants and children being killed in situations of conquest, so it does happen in humans. Now, just a little bit of a trip through non-hunting and gathering cultures. The Yanomamo are actually partly hunting and gathering. They're known as the fierce people because of both of the role of ritual fighting and real fighting and raiding in their society. So tomorrow I'll talk more about the Kong, who Dr. Bowen talked about today, and they are among the least violent of societies. Not completely nonviolent, as she pointed out, but these are among the most violent societies. So this is a canoe war expedition among the Asmat of New Guinea, and these wars and raids, especially even more the raids and feuds, ongoing feuds than the pitched battles. Battle and feuding and raiding back and forth have give you a repetitive cycle of killing and revenge in some societies, like a lot of the ones in New Guinea, and also the Yanomamo and others, and the Hatfields and McCoys are a human example. And Rusnov, my colleague, studied the Gibusi, who among ever married men, 32% of the deaths resulted from homicide. Among young men never married, 53% of the deaths resulted from homicide. This is colossal, and in fact, John Barr, professor of history, American history, and expert on Lincoln, is here, said that some of his students were Marines who told him that the casualty rates in the Civil War would be absolutely unacceptable in modern American warfare, and the casualty rates, I think he said 50% in some battles. That was the high end, and that's what what you have here. Not in a war, which is the percentage of soldiers. This is the percentage of all deaths in an ordinary time of the society's history, and the young Marines said 1% would be unacceptably high today, and so that gives you an idea. And this is a painting of the reconciliation of the Montagues and Capulets over the bodies of their beloved children, another consequence of human feuding depicted in Shakespeare. Okay, so who kills? Hint, I'll give you a hint. Not women. This is male victims, male offenders, and by the way, the great majority of victims of homicide, contrary to what you might think by some analyses today, the great majority of victims of homicide are and always have been male too. But the difference is much bigger between male offenders and female offenders, and you can see that difference right there. So 90% of homicides are committed by males, and that's a cross-culturally true statement. Dominance and obedience play an important role in hierarchies, and I'll say a little bit more about that, but it's not so. Once you get organized violence and you get a stratified society with organized violence, you're really jacking up the possibility of bad deeds, and that happened immediately with the rise of civilization. So Dr. Bone was talking about the Ailu, who are descendants of the Inca, and they were like this too. This is a model of a phalanx of Egyptian soldiers that was buried in a tomb of one of the pharaohs, one of the princes of Egypt, ancient Egypt. And this is what, if you were a rural person in the vicinity of Egypt, somewhere in the Middle East between the Egyptians and the Hittites and the Babylonians, and you would see something like this coming at you from one direction or another, and pretty soon you'd be a captive, and your daughters or sisters or even wife would be a concubine of some important soldier, and you would be either enslaved or trained to be the empire. And that's the way civilization worked, and that's why I always put the word civilization in quotes. You know, people think civilization, oh, great architecture, great paintings and sculptures, and they'll go to the museum. I was in the Houston Fine Arts Museum yesterday, absolutely great museum, and you see all these beautiful things that were created by civilizations who did all these horrible things. There's a quote from Marx. He says something like capitalism arose from the mud, oozing blood from every pore, or the words in German to that effect. I don't know if it's true of capitalism, but it's definitely true of civilization. The ancient civilizations literally arose from the mud of irrigated lands, and they practically had blood oozing from every pore because of the amount of conquest they were engaged in. And that could become ritualized. We know that not only the Aztecs, but many ancient civilizations, including the Inca, were doing human sacrifices, not necessarily with this particular religious ideology, but that's what's a big part of what civilization means to me. And eventually, we get modern instances of it, like these two, and you can just enumerate the others in your own mind. This may be something that some people would not be putting in the category of a civilization that's doing a genocide, but this one of a genocide perpetrated by one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth at the time. Okay, so what are the mechanisms? This is Paul MacLean's triune brain model. It's a great oversimplification. Some neurobiologists will complain if you even talk about it, because it seems to suggest that there are three separate levels, and that this is an evolutionary cartoon which tells us something very important to my mind, which is that we have, in the course of our brain evolution, not replaced old structures with new ones. We have added newer structures to older ones, and kept the old ones at every stage of the game. So that means that we have a reptilian brain inside us, inside our heads, and so this is the a Komodo dragon. It's called. It's about the size of a person. It has a brain maybe this big at most, and that doesn't look like much compared to our brains. But look at all the things it can do. They can, with that little teensy brain, they can hunt, kill prey, fight and defend territory, find mates, have sex, build and defend nests. They can do everything that they need to do to survive, some of which is pretty complicated. You go on to the what's called the paleo-mammalian brain. That is the simplest mammalian brain, which here is shown inside our brain. A more elaborated limbic system. We call them the 4 Fs: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and sex, but with more emotion and learning and memory and imitation, which eventually becomes a basis of society and culture. We do have all these impulses coming from below in our brains all the time, and then we have this built-up cortex around it, and especially the frontal cortex is what inhibits the limbic system impulses. And there are many imaging studies in the last few years that show balance between, say, the amygdala, which is a center for fear and aggression, and the frontal lobes, and how that differs in different individuals. Males, by the way, human males have larger amygdalas with more testosterone receptors on them. And this is a picture of, it's a computer simulation done by Hanna Damasio and colleagues of a famous case from the 1860s. The skull is still here. The instrument that damaged the brain is still here. And this is Phineas Gage, who was a railroad boss who was tamping gunpowder or some equivalent into a hole in the rock when they were building the transcontinental railroad, and it exploded, and it was an incredibly freakish accident because the path traversed by this rod is shown in the simulation, and it went through his left cheek and up through it knocked out his left eye and went out through his frontal cortex. And Hanna Damasio, with this simulation, was able to specify pretty well what part of the frontal cortex he actually lost. But the thing is, he woke up within something less than an hour, if I remember right, and he seemed normal, and he was walking and talking, but those who knew him said he was no longer Gage. So what did that mean? Well, the doctor recorded, a doctor named Harlow recorded the case. He said he could calculate, he could speak, he could understand everything. He said, why was he no longer Gage? Because he had personality change, and he no longer had the impulse control that he had right before the accident, when he was considered one of the most valuable employees of the railroad, and respected by the men he was supervising and colleagues and bosses and so on. And his life fell apart. He was no longer making good judgments. He was having outbursts of emotion, and eventually, in a sad outcome, he became sort of a carnival attraction. So that's the human frontal lobe, and that's what happens if you lose it. And this is a PET scan showing less activity in the prefrontal cortex of a convicted killer than a so-called normal person. And you all, I don't have to explain why I say so-called normal, since we all have, and I don't necessarily have a claim on that label, and maybe none of us do. So this is just to remind us that there is increasing evidence of the contribution of genes to aggression and differences in aggression. I am mostly focused on the universals of human nature, the genes that can predispose all of us to aggression. This is a study from 2010 in which a gene was found that predisposes individuals to greater impulsivity. And that is not going to be one gene for impulsivity. Impulsivity or aggression or anything like height, weight, heart disease, anything complicated that you can think of is not one gene, but somewhere between hundreds and thousands of genes. But we're finding out that individual genes do influence aggressiveness, and we've known for a long time from twin studies and adoption studies that aggressiveness can run in families. And this is just a picture of this. So the gene is identified, the mutated gene. It's part of a serotonin receptor, and so the serotonin pathway is different in these individuals, and that's what makes their aggression. All right, development. This is a picture of Kong children, 18. Sorry. So this infant is 10 months old, a male infant pushing another infant over and digging his fingers and scratching the other kid's skin. It starts very early in life, and I think can perhaps attribute it partly, the emergence partly to just physical development, but partly to the development of these major fiber bundles in connecting different parts of the limbic system, which is developing in advance of the frontal cortex that's going to ultimately inhibit the limbic system. And in this graph, you can see the amount of hitting, biting, and kicking, and observations of of toddlers and preschoolers, there's a steady decline in the percentage at each age who are often doing those things or sometimes doing those things. And you can see there is a sex difference. But the girls do it too. So there's 2 points here. The decline and the sex difference. But both boys and girls are aggressive in this age range. How does the teenage brain work if you get further on in development? We know something new about the teenage brain. And by the way, this is Natalie Wood and James Dean. For those of you who are too young, James Dean was a wonderful, wonderful actor who died in a motorcycle accident. Very much in the vein of how young males typically die. And so here's something we found out in just the last 20 years or so. There is ongoing development in the frontal cortex throughout not only childhood but adolescence. So, and it continues to age 25. And that developmental change that you see here, I won't go into the details, but it's very important in the development of inhibition of those limbic system impulses. Now I'll point out to you an interesting fact, which is that if you go back 2 centuries and look at the age of puberty, that's where it is approximately. And it has dropped over the past 2 centuries at least 2 years, if not more. So unless brain development has also accelerated, which is actually, we don't know, but there's not much reason to believe that, we are now getting the assault of pubertal hormones against a less developed frontal cortex. And so there's a psychologist and a jurist who wrote a famous article some years ago called "Less Guilty by Reason of Adolescence," and so there's arguments going on now about whether it's fair to hold adolescents who don't have a fully developed inhibitory circuitry to the same account that you would hold an adult. Okay, so some of you know that, or some of you heard me talk about this male versus female thing before, but let me just briefly summarize the reasons I think males and females are very different. This is androgens over the life course, months of gestation, birth, puberty, and adult life. This is females down here. Girls and women have an increase in testosterone in adolescence. That's important, but it's nowhere near like the male increase. And males have a huge surge of testosterone and other androgens in prenatal life, which we know is influential in shaping the brain, and is why there is a sex difference in aggressive behavior at age 3 or 4 or 5, long before the hormones of puberty come in. And there's an artist's depiction of the difference. So that's now focus for a moment on what happens here. That's a 10 or more times increase in the level of testosterone. And what does testosterone do? Well, from countless rat experiments, we know that if you castrate males, their number of biting attacks per session goes way down to 0. If you castrate females, ovary-ectomized females, nothing happens. If you replace the castrated males with testosterone, their biting attacks go right back up to where they were before, and then come down again if you stop giving the testosterone injections. So there's a little something on your mind, son, is what the father is saying, and nope is what the son is saying. I imagine some of you have seen this conversation in your practices. But there's a lot going on in the mind of a young adolescent male who who is under the assault of that gigantic increase in testosterone. Um, and it's not surprising that cross-culturally, you look at the beginning of crime. So this is the age at first arrest both for boys in England and in Western Samoa. And those are superimposable curves in two cultures that are very different in many ways. And by the way, remember I said that females also have the apparatus of aggressiveness, even though they have different tendencies established in utero. This is what happens if you give estrogen to females, to their frequency of fighting. This is rats. This is what happens if you give placebo, and this is what happens if you give testosterone. So you get the effects from the same apparatus with the same hormone, but it won't be as big as an effect as you get in males, and and that's important to understand. Okay, so we're wrapping up here. What do we conclude? Well, one conclusion, Jean-Paul Sartre said, there is no human nature. Man simply is. He is what he wills. Sure. But the question is, what does he will, and why does he will it? And the great French philosopher didn't get to that next two questions. And I think we understand increasingly that there is a human nature, and it explains what we will and why we will it. And by the way, I don't even object very strongly to the masculine gender in that sentence, because a lot of what I'm talking about is wrong is indeed he, and not she. Although there's plenty of things to say about she's that aren't so pleasant either. Henry James, life is in fact a battle. Evil is insolent and strong, beauty enchanting but rare, goodness very apt to be weak, folly very apt to be defiant, wickedness to carry the day, imbeciles to be in great places, people of sense in small, and mankind generally unhappy. But the world as it stands is no narrow illusion, no phantasm, no evil dream of a night. We wake up to it again forever and ever, and we can neither forget it nor deny it nor dispense with it. I told you I was going to make you feel bad today, right? Goethe. All the highly learned schoolmasters are agreed that a child does not know why he wants something, but that adults, too, like children, stagger about on this earth of ours and do not know where they come from or where they are going. That they act just as little in accordance with true purpose and are governed just as much by biscuits and cake and birch rods. No one wants to believe that, and yet it seems to me that this is palpably so. So I don't need to tell you what the flaws in normal human nature are. They're listed here. I've been talking mostly about violence, but all these things are flaws that affect our destiny. And I certainly don't need to tell this group about the so-called abnormal flaws in human nature. And all societies have all these things at some level. You can argue about whether the developing world has different levels of this or that, but these are why do I say they're a part of human nature? Obviously, we don't all have them, but in any human population, some percentage has them, and I think that's very important part of understanding human nature. So this is a cover of a supermarket checkout newspaper that I saw. Ape man baffles scientists and claim, a big news story about capturing an ape man who was in transition from apes to humans. And of course, my opinion is that we are the real ape man, and we are baffling scientists every day. I tried to understand that better in The Tangled Wing with this comment about Archaeopteryx being only a partly evolved bird. And that's the metaphor of the tangled wing. This is sort of a test here when this book first came out of what how metaphorically people are able to think, because they would ask me what the tangled wing meant, what the title meant, and I would say, well, read the subtitle, Biological Constraints on the Human Spirit. And some people still didn't get it. But the image of the tangled wing is we're not really ready to fly because we haven't liberated ourselves from the biological constraints. Okay, now we have the wisdom of Pogo. I don't think you can read this, but this is, so the two swamp animals are sitting there talking, and one says, I've been reading about how maybe these planets peopled by folks with advanced brains. On the other hand, maybe we got the most brains. Maybe our intellects is the universe's most advanced. Either way, it's a mighty sobering thought. I think there are advanced brains elsewhere in the universe. I don't have any doubt about that, really. Some of them are probably more advanced than ours, but many. I bet there are many planets in the universe where life has evolved, become advanced and intelligent, and extinguished itself, just like we might do right now. So that's a big bottleneck in the mathematical modeling of intelligent life in the universe. What happens when you get to our stage? And what are your chances of getting to the next without blowing yourself up and destroying the planet? And nobody really knows the answer to that. I don't have to tell you what the problems that we're facing are, but I can tell you that all these things are serious, and they're all impossible to understand without a concept of human nature, and they're all none of them is that difficult to understand if you do have an appropriate concept of human nature. So I would just leave you with this idea of the Earth as a family farm. Dr. Bowen was talking about the elder Dr. Bowen's growing up on a family farm, and talking about family farms in three different cultures. Now that the Bushmen have them too, and some people don't like it when I say this because it implies the end of nature, and it implies too much control and so on. But here's what I'm trying to imply with this phrase, and it's not my phrase. I adopted it from some ecological writer whose name I don't remember. It's the idea that we are all now in charge of what happens to the Earth. It's our family plot. We are and therefore we are a family. And if you had a family farm, you wouldn't be, urinating in it and treating it badly. You wouldn't be overexploiting it. You wouldn't be treating it in a way that ignores your children and grandchildren's prospects. And I think we have to think about the Earth in the same way. But so what are the chances that we'll be able to do that? I'd say, given everything that I know, not that great. But this is the way I certainly think about it. It's a cliche, but a lot of cliches are there because they're true. This is the us, and the thing we have to figure out and understand better and better. This is the world, and I don't know what's going to happen next. Thank you for listening, and tomorrow I'll say something more positive.
My name's Jerry Miller. I'm the executive director of the Evolution Institute.
Oh.
And I think you attended you presented
sorry.
at our
I'm
first
sorry.
workshop.
Yeah. The David Sloan Wilson
Yeah, David Sloan Wilson.
is your colleague there. And,
yeah.
I have been to it. It's a very impressive project.
Recently we had a workshop, and one of the strands of research I found really interesting is the development of, in infants, the concepts of trust and fairness and that sort of thing. And looking at your slide about aggression and seeing how that emerges very naturally in infants, are they orthogonal? I mean, can you be highly aggressive and highly cooperative and highly trusting at the same time? Are they different components? Are they opposites? Is it a continuum?
Well, that's a really good question. No doubt that the same individuals can be highly cooperative and highly aggressive.
Right.
And in fact, if Bowles and Gintis and some others are right about human evolution, we're cooperative because we were aggressive at the group level and defending ourselves at the group level. And that I know that the Evolution Institute emphasizes group selection very strongly, and I think the jury is still out on how big a force group selection is in humans. But there's no doubt that there's a dark side of group selection. Group selection means a selection for greater cooperation. It could also mean that it came from intergroup conflict, which frequently could be the worst kind of conflict. So those same individuals are cooperating marvelously among themselves. Just watch a World War II movie, and you see that cooperation, and yet they're directing tremendous aggression outward.
I wonder if, using the triune brain model, if aggression would be more in the reptilian part and cooperation might be more in the mammalian part.
Yes, I will say yes to that. I'll try and say more about it tomorrow. The reptiles really do not seem to have relationships. The first relationship, which was probably the mother-offspring relationship at the core, and that drove the evolution of the paleo-mammalian brain from the reptilian background, was all about relationships and cooperation. For reptiles, they, for the most part, a little bit of exception with alligators. For the most part, they lay their eggs, and it's goodbye and good luck to the offspring. And once you get, and they have no relationships between male and female, no real sibling relationships. All that comes in with the mammalian brain, and so yes, I would say that that's the foundation of cooperation. But then you get, I think, more cooperation in mammals with more advanced brains, and the most cooperation in primates, and among primates, the most cooperation in humans.
Yeah, I think that's the other issue I want to ask your views on. It strikes me that human cooperation is unique in the sense, I think the term is used, ultra or uber sociality, in that they're the only species that will cooperate extensively with non-kin. Was that your assessment?
That is true as far as I know, and one of the hallmarks of humans. I mean, when Dr. Bowen was talking earlier about reciprocity in smaller scale societies, that often is among kin, although it also can extend and does extend beyond kin. I'll try and talk about that tomorrow. So, the advent of denser populations with the rise of so-called civilization and coming to our level of advancement, industrial and post-industrial society, as it's unique even among humans in the amount of cooperation outside of kin groups, even with strangers.
Okay.
Maybe we can talk some more later and tomorrow. Those are great questions, but I want to.
Okay, I'm Stephanie Ferreira. We've met before, Dr.
Of course.
Konner. So many thoughts about.
Stephanie wrote a review of my book, Women
Yes,
After All, in the light of Bowen theory, which
Yeah,
taught me a
the
lot
fam-
about
yeah.
Bowen theory.
Eventually,
But,
that'll come into the Family Systems Journal, the review on Women After All, which was quite an adventure. I highly recommend it. I'm just thinking about the multi-level selection, and Dr. Miller had kindly provided us with an article by two people, Gowdy and Kroll, on the economic forces that drive us toward the ultra-sociality that, or maybe Edward Wilson talked about eusociality. But the idea that groups, for all our struggles and conflict within and between groups, under threat, there's a tendency for the group to come together, so that you could have loosely organized groups, but you also could have tightly organized, and we tend to go into the tightly organized mode, I think, when there's an outside threat, which can be considered tribalism or nationalism, or, where differences are put aside and the common mission is to protect the group. Can you, that's, because Dr. Bowen had this sense of how we are part of all life, but in his writings he didn't get into the details of evolutionary biology. So the ideas of levels of selection and all of that, he didn't really comment on that. He concentrated on looking at the family process. So those are some of my thoughts. Do you want to?
Yeah. So the quality and tightness of cooperation when defending the group from outside threats, or maybe even creating the outside threat from within your group, that is a principle of human behavior and human nature that you can take to the bank. That is seen over and over again in organized aggression, war. So I still have a lot of things to learn about Murray Bowen's models, and I think, from what I understand, he was less fanciful and more level-headed about introducing evolutionary concepts than Freud was, and yet, as I said earlier, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I have this sense that one of the things he had in common with Freud was, let's not go to La La Land with our patients and families and say, everything's going to be harmonious and fine. Rather, let's accept that the things that go wrong come from fundamental sources, not from departures from the natural equilibrium. Is that right about Bowen? Would you say that that's right?
Yeah, well, I think he was looking at the family as a natural system with its potential for high levels of cooperation and its potential for regressing and becoming very, becoming fragmented and emotional cutoff. And, it was very much always on a continuum. There was a wide range of behavior. And Dr. Bowen, I think, was very familiar with Paul MacLean's work, and they were at NIMH at the same time. So I think he thought in terms of these levels. But the continuum thinking, I think is more, I see more of that in Bowen than I do in reading evolutionary biology. That with increasing chronic anxiety, the nature of the organism changes. the organism is different under higher levels of
Under
anxiety.
higher levels of stress. Yeah.
And that brings
Yeah, I
out
think-
a different kind of behavior.
Yeah. I think the continuum idea is in evolutionary biology. It's in the levels of selection for one thing, but it's also in the impact of stress. You know, a very interesting thing happened when after 1977, I think that Sarah Hurdy's book on Langers was published, and then there was a spate of studies where people tried to argue that her Langers were under exceptional stress and their contact with humans made this happen and so on. I mean, now we know that it's totally wrong because it's seen in all kinds of different situations. But during that controversy, I remember telling my students and writing in the Tangled Wing, I think, that in a sense it doesn't matter because of the continuum. And I tell my students to this day, life is stress.
Yes.
Evolution is stress.
Yeah.
So don't come along and tell me, well, there was some stress there, and that's why those bad boy male Langers killed those babies. Stress is everywhere, ubiquitous. It's the environmental substrate of the evolution of all life, and so to one degree or another, you know, the continuum of the amount of stress, the organism is built to respond differently to different levels of stress, but there's no such thing as no stress. There is. I do believe in the concept that Hans Selye had of eustress. You mentioned eusocial, and so he defined eustress as different from distress. Eustress, I think he would say, was what I had this morning, you know, preparing the last few slides in my talk, and so if to the extent that I rose to the occasion, that was a positive part of my adaptation to be under subjective stress, coming from the environment and ultimately coming from my own decision to say yes to the invitation to be here, and that all that is part of the process of adaptation, and that's positive stress. You know, this whole idea that you encounter sometimes with parents today. I've got to protect my child from every form of stress at all costs, and you know, my reaction to that is, if you never have if a child never has any stress, the child never gets to slam her pencil down on the table and say, "I did it." That I did it feeling doesn't come without stress.
Yeah. Well, that I think would be completely consistent with Murray Bowen.
It would. Oh, good. Good.
I'd like to begin the panel by inviting the two presenters to comment, discuss, raise questions about each other's presentation, and then I'll open it up again to the floor, and I may have a comment or question of my own. So would one of you like to begin with thoughts or questions stirred?
Well, I had a question about
Go ahead, I'm
Dr.
still
Bowen's
formulating all my thoughts.
presentation.
so
I've
go ahead.
had more time, and so I've already said that it's my kind of anthropology, and really superb in every way, and including the wonderful depiction of the Bushman or Kung. And when you were talking about Suffield, I was thinking 1765 to 1800. I mean, that period that you're looking at includes the Revolutionary War, the formation of the nation, the Constitution, the Washington administration goes right up to the election of Thomas Jefferson, basically. And we were trying to talk about how you connect the family in the community, and then the community in the larger world. So, what is there anything that you found out about how those larger national and international events affected Suffield?
It's a really interesting question. Is that okay? I found not a single reference in the account books about the war. None. Zero.
Wow.
Um,
Amazing. And how
even-
many account books?
Well, I
a lot.
cruised through 200 and I mined 15.
Wow.
Initially, I came out with 2,000 people I needed to track down. So, and I found a way to narrow it to 431 to be exact. And all the roamings through those documents that were related about what was going on at home on the farm, not a single reference that I can remember. And so how do you put that together? Well, I don't know. They were recording what was happening on a day-to-day basis. And they had to have been aware of all this. A lot of the market sort of surged after the war. So, I've always wondered about that. And, when you started talking in New England, there's no memory of the Civil War. It's not something the documents talked about. In the agricultural records and all, they didn't talk about the war. So there is some separation or,
How far is Suffield from Boston and New York?
it was just a short hop, skip. It's right on the Hartford Airport. Part of Suffield is now part of the airport. So it was very close to that. It was, 2 hours from Boston, maybe?
2 hours now.
Yeah. I mean, it was,
So
it's from the Connecticut River Valley, and Boston's right near the Atlantic Ocean. So,
maybe
and it was closer to New York City, in fact.
Were there troop movements that got to Suffield, or?
None that I saw. And I too was focused on reconstructing what I called the subsistence system. So I really wasn't looking for it. And, what you're presenting, and this is kind of my comments, is that it's sort of good research produces bigger questions. And, and to understand and reconstruct what I had to contextualize and get down into the details of why one meat was preserved and not another. And so you're working on different levels and different scales all the time. And this is, a question that needs to be answered. So how do you elicit the emotional reactivity out of the documentary sources? You can get them out of diaries, and they come out of the heads and the perception of the individual who's writing. And it's one of the dilemmas, and from some of the historians that write, today there's more of a storytelling, and some I think are better factually based, but I think a lot of them come out of their own perceptions about what is. I mean, there's a whole range. But golly, I don't have a good answer, except that I was stunned. Now, there's another thing that one of my committee members had to sort of bring me to reality, is these account books recorded the male activity, and there's always a division of labor. And he kept asking, and this was Jim Dietz, the archaeologist, kept asking me, where's the sausage? In my defense, and I went, the sausage? Well, the sausage were made by women. So what I reconstructed today for the, based on the documents that I had, was this male world.
And if a young man in the family went off to war or was killed,
I'd have to go into the Revolutionary War records to do this, and that would be really interesting. There's another level. The account book keepers were the wealthier people. And, when you go into reciprocal exchange, farm relationships, wonderful studies by John Bennett and some of the others, is that that middling farmers, in the middle group, they were all creating their ego-centered relationships based on what they had in their, and there was another level of it. So what I read was that you tended to establish your work relationships with people of your own wealth group. So what I was able to capture was this wealthier group. What I was not able to capture was this middling group. And my reading is that a lot of that was kept in the heads. And I would, there was one account book out there that to go back into these middling farmers, and start working with them, you would see maybe a different response. And that, now that I'm thinking about it, if you can start getting into these different demographic levels and how they were interacting and how it changed through that time, you might be able to get a sense indirectly of the impact of the war. That's just a guess. So I guess my opportunity to, I guess the ideas kept coming, but I found your presentation looking at the biology of the behavior to be incredibly strong, and I was amazed at what Murray Bowen foresaw without having the exact science had not emerged in a sense, or he hadn't encountered it. I know at one point in his life he said, "I can't do it all." And there was a time, which I actually saw when we cleaned out his library and his library books, that there was a time when he decided to bring in a scientist to start opening the door for the family therapist to start understanding. And it was open. He said, come up with an idea and do it. And what you saw in his library is that his students and colleagues started sending him books and signing it. And, and we're creating an Excel file of this. And so you'll begin to see, I think you could sort of track out sort of the diversity of where students went and the openness that he applied to go forth. And he would say to me, he said, some will take it very far, but everybody will benefit from it. So, and your work is just wonderful. I was thinking about aggression and a lot of the other things in the triune brain, and anyway, that I'll have more thoughts as we sort of work along.
I wonder how you, if you explain maybe a little more about how you think he thought about the potential role for biology and in his thinking about family therapy. And I know that he thought it was going to be important. He couldn't do it all himself, but did he say anything about aggression, for example?
Not that I can remember. Murray Bowen was an incredible opportunist, seeing resources around him. And my memory was that Michael Kerr had the degree in medicine and the background in biology. And that was one of the early efforts towards looking into science. And Mike did it by looking at cancer and did, I think a real contribution. And things sort of grew from there. And I can't remember the date at which he started bringing in the scientist. So Dan or any, when? 75. So that was pretty early. There was 15 years, and you could see the incredible growth in that time.
Well, I'd like to learn more about the cancer. My family was disrupted by my wife's diagnosis with cancer and her death 8 years later. To put it mildly, it was disrupted, and the family dynamics are something I personally need to understand better to this day. Somebody had a question there.
Let me open it on up. We've got about 15 more minutes before the break for lunch. So those who are interested in comments and questions, please line up.
Oh, my name is Joanne Gillis Donovan. I'm from Philadelphia. I was listening to the comment about how the descriptions of societies didn't really include women and what their role was in all of it. And in 1990, Carolyn Brott and I had written an article on the power of the invisible woman in the family held business, talking about how the guys would go home and the women would basically tell them how things were going to go in that business when they went back to the office, and how much power women had, but how little recognition there was in the descriptors of how the family held business ran that included the role of women. So I was just interested in that point.
Let's see, I don't know quite how to comment on it, but there are some really wonderful studies on women that I really haven't gotten into. There's some, they had their own economic role in a family that was absolutely critical. On the farm, in the English, British world, they took care of the small livestock. They were in charge of butter, of making the butter, the dairy, and all. And so one would need to get into a whole different set of documents that would actually fill out the picture much more fully.
One of the comments I would add to that is that Murray Bowen's emphasis on the importance of doing nuclear family histories for every branch of the family as far back as possible captures and addresses some of the questions that you two both have discussed and that were raised by the comment, that a family history will include both males, females, and how they function in the family, in the community, and in their economy. It's really a fascinating methodology for therapy and coaching to encourage people to do that kind of study. And I don't think that has been fully developed or exploited in the literature to the extent it could. The contributions that can be made by that process and by what we learn are tremendous, I think. It's interesting how it would have a place.
So I'd like to add that this is where the ethnologists going out and working with the societies today and looking at the division of labor and looking at women and men and how that is grounded in the economic system, I think would be a tremendous gift. And particularly working with some of the societies that are still working with these subsistence systems, because you need to somehow capture what it is in a more traditional, if you're going to understand what is happening today. So
I would comment that in anthropology, beginning with Margaret Mead, women have played a much bigger role, leadership role in our field than a lot of other academic disciplines. It seems to me there's been a kind of revolution in historiography over the last 2 or 3 decades with women historians writing about historical women. And in my case, I went to Botswana to study infant development and early childhood, and inevitably I was also studying women, even though that wasn't my initial intent. Women did traditionally 90% of the child care and also provide 70% of the food, and so through gathering. And so I always say the idea that the working mother is something new is absolutely ridiculous, and it was just a blip in the upper middle class in the 1950s in America, and basically, and so I have to apologize for mansplaining about women. It's just been clear to me for so long that women's roles have been underestimated by academia generally, and that's how the seed was planted for me to eventually write my book about women.
There are 2 good brains at the microphone out there and 10 mere minutes, so please begin.
Gotta come.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I don't know. I hope I can live up to it. I'm Pat Camella. And Victoria's comment about the importance of the nuclear family histories, pushing them back as many generations as possible. In doing some volunteer work with the Murray Bowen Archives Project, as we were doing the initial processing of what is called the Williamsburg Collection, I recall coming across many materials that Dr. Bowen had written in letters, and also it seemed to me he had almost a booklet, a small booklet on doing that sort of research. I recall looking at some of the letters, and he, in writing to his correspondence, he would always have a suggestion as to where to look, where one might look, how one might think about the movement of families, and was it really an individual coming in, or was there evidence that one could find that a whole family moved at one time, etc. And I think that someday when the materials actually become available, that there would be opportunity to understand much better about the way he approached the research into his own family. And I was wondering if Dr. Joanne Bowen would have any thoughts about that.
I'll relay a quick story of, I've read those letters, I heard them. We would go to places and walk through cemeteries. And what is interesting is I learned a lot about my dad's family. For reasons that I don't understand, we didn't learn much in my family about my mother's family. All I knew was she was born in a little town in Hollis, Oklahoma. She knew all her cousins. She and her family left at an early time. And so I was at a meeting in Fort Worth just a few weeks ago, and this was an opportunity to visit Hollis. And so I went online and got cemetery records, and she had written a genealogy going out 5 generations that I'd never really seen but found in a box. And oh my gosh, what a time I had. I had no idea. By walking through the cemetery and finding the addresses of these, I learned my great-grandmother remarried after my great-grandfather died. I know that they came back to town. And then I found the man that my great-grandmother married. I found his safe in the Historical Society. And then I went, oh my gosh. My great-grandfather came in, and they moved in 1902, and there were at least 2 of his siblings that came at the same time. Nobody's there right now, but I can tell you the impact it had on me and my perception of their life ways, and I came home with a new energy, a new knowledge, beginning to understand my mother and her sisters and my grandmother in a way that I never had before, about how families, connect and disconnect. It didn't pass down to my generation, but I started seeing a whole different, and I think this is sort of one story that many could tell about walking back into your family's past and starting to understand who you are or who I am in a different way. And that is one of the gifts of Murray Bowen, I think, of looking back into the past.
Dr. Barr.
John Barr from Lone Star College, and I'm a historian. Mel, your comment reminded me of a book that was published a few years ago called A Midwife's Tale, which was a diary of a midwife in Maine. I don't think, if I'm mistaken, I don't think she ever mentioned the Revolution, Martha Ballard, in her diary. so it just may not have hit them in certain communities. But so that's just a comment that was stimulated by your question. But thank you both for your presentations. They were excellent. And one of the things that I was thinking about as each of you were talking, it reminded me of some of Ian Morris's work on farmers, foragers, and fossil fuels, in which he argues that the way human beings capture energy is what really determines our values, and that as we capture energy differently, our values change, so that the values of a hierarchical or agricultural society is going to not be quite the same thing as a hunter-gatherer society. And so I was wondering, as we move away from fossil fuels over the next 100 years, and this is a purely speculative question, so you can't be wrong, right? But might some of those constraints on the biological, on the human spirit, maybe be removed, and with medical technologies? And when you mentioning about Joanna, about social relations changing in communities from outside influences, the same sort of thing just occurred to me. So I'll let you all answer.
You want to start? I'm not quite sure where to go.
A great question,
Yeah.
and so I don't see why not. Although I mean, I find that people underestimate how slow evolution is, at least in the genetic sense. There, I hope, is going to be universal solar energy within a century or so, and no evolution will take place. Significant genetic evolution will take place for thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, but human society will be very different. And I think that if I could broaden the answer a little bit, we are not just in terms of energy sources, but in terms of water, fresh water, in terms of pollution, in terms of competition for resources, in terms of population growth. I mean, we are living the first experience of humans who think that we have to start taking care of nature. Really, I mean, people thought, okay, we have to take care of the family farm or the village or something, but and I'd like to hear what Joanne says about this, but really the whole of human history has been the attitude toward nature, either it's dangerous and I have to defend myself, and that was really true, and it's still true to some extent, but I mean, imagine if your whole life was just dominated by that thought. And the other thought then was, I'll be safest if I dominate nature. And we dominate nature, we cooperate to dominate nature, and then you have people competing to dominate the same pieces of nature. And that intensifies with increasing population and population density, and you could interpret the whole of history as a channeling of human aggressive and fear impulses and impulses for reproduction, or sex at least, into competition for domination over nature, which we can no longer afford to so my generation was telling our parents a little bit about how we have to change our views on that. My children are telling me a lot about it, and have changed my habits a lot. And the whole species is going to have to make that transition quite fully in order for us to survive.
I was thinking, if you look over the long term and the evolution of human societies from foraging into horticulture, into agriculture, into pastoralism, into intensive forms of agriculture, the thing is constant is the human species cooperating, relating, the social relationships. And they change in some people look at it in evolution, and others say, oh my gosh, there's so much diversity, but looking at it, they typically change, and they're very, with the very similar set of social relationships and economic formations as you move into one to another. So looking at from an evolutionary viewpoint, I would say the one thing is constant is the human species cooperation and the need for labor. And how it will evolve as subsistence-oriented agriculture goes, or however it may evolve, I think is a wonderful way to think about it. And the species needs it to survive. And I would insert, to me, the other thing that the digital age and people communicating to each other through their smartphone or sitting in classes and they do their projects on their smartphone when everybody's around them. That's the new way it's going. Is an element that needs to be thought about because that's going to affect the way the brain functions. So there's technology changing, but there's also this sociality of the human that I think people need to really think about so carefully. And I guess in some ways what I fear more is the social disconnects that come through our own technology than another form of energy. So
Dr. Bowen, I must conclude the panel and the morning presentations and thinking, and I have just received a message from your father.
And
As you were talking, I heard Murray Bowen say, the difference, people, is differentiation of self. I did. And my thought,
could you turn on
I'll
his
leave
mic
you
for
with
us?
this, that I think, signing my name to this, that one way, an important way to account for the variation in when cooperation produces more warfare and when cooperation produces more creativity or resilience is the level of differentiation of self in the group. And that cooperation or the social group in the human is going to rely on the capacity for the kind of intellectual activity and vigor that is represented by differentiation in the face of the relationship pressures. I get to end on that. Thank you.
That's a good point.
And this meeting will